I'll call the meeting to order. Can we have some discipline around the table, please? Welcome. I declare the meeting of the Corporate and Strategic Committee open, and want to welcome Mike Paku as the representative of the Māori Committee. And I wonder whether Mike could just give us a few words of prayer and wisdom for the meeting.
Te mana, ai mi kia koutou I tai mai I tēnei ata, e pānga tātou mahi, ta mahi o te matawa Māori, ta kaunihere o te matawa Māori. Ai mi hoki kia tata manuhiri I tai mai te wanganui a mātou I tēnei ata. He mi atu ki a rātou he pānga I te kapua ka pauri, he mihi nunui ki te pāngai o te taone nunui o Manchester, o tērā mahi kino, ka nui tāroha ki a rātou I tēnei wā. So just I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning, and of course to our guests and those that are presenting to us this morning. Thank you very much. And of course to, at this point in time, to those in Manchester who have gone through the recent tragedy of having seen loss of life, especially the sad part about it, many of them being so young, and that this particular conflict that's currently going on around the world, when it reaches down and touches children, and children become the victims of this type of belief in one's religion. That's not good. So with that, let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we give praise to you this morning. We thank you for bringing us all here safely. We especially ask that you be with those families in Manchester and anywhere else in the world that are underneath great tribulation at this point in time, and especially for our particular partners back here in the Hawke's Bay, those that are suffering loss at the moment. We ask that you be with them. We ask this in your name, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Mike. Now, councillors and committee, are there any notices or apologies? Councillor Dick.
Chairman.
Councillor Hewitt.
I have a notice, but I'm just going to...
It's okay. Just while Councillor Hewitt is finding that, I do have an apology from Mike Mohi, and we should note that the Regional Planning Committee rep is yet to be appointed, so we're one down in terms of numbers from that committee at the moment. Councillor Barker.
I have to be away at 3:45 to collect some from the airport at 4 o'clock. And I'd like to move that Mr. Mohi's apology be received and accepted.
We've had a mover that Mr. Mohi's apology be received. Thank you. Seconded to Councillor Graham. All those in favour? Thank you. Councillor Hewitt, did you have a notice?
Yes, and I understand it's been emailed to Leanne, has it, or it's about to be? This is just a declaration from the Auditor General for my participation, and so I'll read it out. The Auditor General declares under Section 6(4) of the Local Authorities Members' Interests Act 1968 that Section 6(1) of the Act will not apply with respect to discussion or voting on all matters leading to the Council's decision about whether to confirm its proposed investment in the Ruataniwha water supply scheme, including the review of the scheme, the criteria for investment in the scheme, the existing conditions precedent and any changes to them, the moratorium that was put in place in November 2016 and any related or ancillary matters. This declaration applies to meetings of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council or any of its committees until the next local government elections in 2019.
Thank you, Councillor. We possibly need to receive that notice. So you're moving that we receive the notice, is that?
No, it's just a notice.
How does that work? Can you help me out? You just record it?
Does it mean?
We don't need to move it and have it on the
Means that
table.
I'm all good to vote from the Auditor General.
Good.
Yeah, thank you, councillor.
So I'll email it to you now, Leanne.
Well, it would be helpful if it was emailed to councillors.
Yes, it would be.
I thought that's more for us than Leanne. I'm puzzled why it's being advised to Leanne. It should be advised to councillors, because we're the ones for whom the information is important.
All right,
It's our decision. I don't know why it's being kept away from councillors.
Well,
No, it's not your decision. It's a decision that's been made by the Auditor General.
Order, councillor. Order, please. That's why I'm suggesting that we actually move to receive the notice, and it's seconded and tabled. So we've got a mover from councillor Hewitt to receive the notice. Can we have a seconder, please? Councillor Wilson. All those in favour of receiving the notice and for it to be tabled? Aye. Thank you. So therefore we have that distributed to all councillors, councillors and committee, we'll move on to, sorry, I do want to advise that there will be a slight adjustments to the order of the agenda. And
Point of order. When the information is supplied, given it's a reply, could we also have supplied the correspondence that led to that? Because it's really important to know what the answer to the question is, as well as the question.
Sorry, councillor, you're referring to the tabled
Yes.
auditor's opinion.
That's right.
I think that's a great idea. Can we?
Like all correspondence should be forwarded to the council if we're to consider it.
Yes. Would Councillor Hewitt be prepared to forward that correspondence as well?
Is that a Lagoima request you're asking for?
It is, in my view, just a matter of courtesy. It's all of us, a courtesy. And if you're going to say to me, to councillors such as myself, that you want me to see this information as a decision by the Auditor General, I would like to see the question that was asked of the Auditor General that prompted it. Seems to me it's just full disclosure. If Councillor Hewitt doesn't want to fully disclose, well, that's her choice. Right. Just a matter of courtesy.
Well, thank you, councillor. Councillor Hewitt, are you comfortable to supply the sequence of correspondence in relation to the Auditor General's opinion?
You can put it through as all other requests go through to councillors.
I'm not sure. Can you just reiterate what you just said?
Any request that comes to me, put it through the office like all other requests come to councillors.
Well, we're tabling this particular, and I'm asking you, councillor, the request has been made, Councillor Hewitt, is whether you'd be prepared to submit all of the correspondence along with the notice that we've just tabled. Are you happy to do that? It's your choice.
Put it through. Put the request through to me officially and you'll get an official response.
Point of order, Chair. That is an official request.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not making an official request. I refuse to be associated with an official request.
Why don't we just calm down and get on with some serious business?
Thank you.
This is nonsense.
Thank you, councillor. Sage advice from our kaumātua. Let's move on. As I was about to say, we, for various reasons, we're looking to move some agenda items around for sequencing and timing, and we're looking to put agenda item 6 and agenda item 8 at the end of the after the public excluded decisions.
End of the what? Sorry.
So at the end of the agenda. So they'll arise after the agenda item 17.
What's the reason for that, Mr. Chairman?
Well, you asked for that, councillor.
No, I asked for 8 to go into the in-committee agenda.
Well, okay, and I've had requests for the others as well. So now we've got 2 items that will go to the end of the agenda. Can I move to agenda item 2, which are conflict of interest declarations? Are there any conflict of interest declarations? There are none. I now move to confirmation of the minutes of the Corporate Strategic Committee of the 15th of February. And I think if I can just get clarification from councillors about our last conversation on exactly how we handle any corrections to minutes. I think we decided that if you had a correction to make, you would forward that to the chair in advance, but is that our general understanding of how we want to
Well,
handle
that was
it?
one councillor's view, but it's not mine, Mr Chairman, and it wasn't decided by resolution.
No, it's
so-
not, councillor, but we're just trying to work this through
Yeah, well,
reasonably. So,
why do we have to make such a fundamental change without a council decision?
all right.
I
Well,
mean,
let's not
just
do
to
that.
save 5 minutes. We're
Yep.
about to lose that 5
Sure.
minutes
All
arguing
right.
about it.
Let's not argue the toss. So we've got the minutes, and are there any obvious corrections that need to be made to them? There being none, now we've got the you've got the minutes in front of you. Where are we up to? We now need to confirm those minutes. Do I have a mover that the minutes are confirmed? Councillor Peter Bevan. Any other? Have got a seconder? Thank you, Mike. So seconded. So we have the minutes. We have confirmation of those. All those in favour of that? Matters arising. Can I get that out of order?
Just one matter arising, Chair, is that the item number 10, the ACC sale of leasehold land cash flows. I've yet to meet with Mr Jury about that particular issue, but we'll do so at some stage in the future.
Councillor Bevan.
On the same matter, which is number 10 in the recorded minutes, it still remains a bit of a black hole for a lot of councillors. I note that there was a mention in our current agenda of the number of properties that had now been freeholded, and it was a pretty significant number, more than I had realised. And in order to try and make some sense of this, I'm wondering if we could ask as a follow-up for Mr Drury to supply us with some information on what the total net sale proceeds have been from all of those sales over the period of time since the negotiations with ACC on selling the forward lease income were commenced.
Can we treat that as an action item, Start? So we'll record it. So that's an action item. Can we have that reported back? I'll quickly go back to the minutes and ask in sequence so we get this right. We've had that item from we've had that matter arising from item 10, but is there anything out of page 2, items 1 to 5, page 3, items 6 and 7, page 4, item 9, page 5, item 8, page 6, item 10 and 11, item 12, no matters arising those. So now we move to item 4, which is a follow-up from the previous meeting, and you've got that schedule on page, I can't even read it, page 5. I wonder who's going to speak to the action items. Mr.
Chair.
Woodham. Mr. Palmer.
Chair, perhaps I'll cover off the bulk of them, if not all of them. The status comments on items 1 to 5 indicate that they are all either on this agenda or under action, and I don't think there's any further comment required in relation to those. Item number 6, can I suggest today that when Ms Dundas is with us that we discuss with her further her thoughts about an appropriate event or facility for councillors to visit as part of their familiarisation of Hawke's Bay Tourism's role in the region. We did have a recent opportunity by way of the International Marathon, and I suspect that we might not have had a great turnout from councillors to attend the marathon in totality, although there may have been one or two that may have been there with boots on. There might be an opportunity that's somewhat more inclusive, Chair. So,
Mike Moe's still finishing it, that's why he's not here.
It's comfortable just to defer to the tourism update at midday for that item. Now we move to receive the action follow-up report. Thank you, Councillor Bailey. Thank you, Councillor Graham. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you. We'll move to agenda item 5, which is the items not on the agenda, and those fall into two categories: urgent items and minor items. Councillor Belford.
I have one urgent item. The Ombudsman has proposed a meeting with me at this point with respect to the Lagoima request that he's been dealing with. Since there are others pending as well, what I want to raise when we get to this item is whether there should be a different sort of meeting, basically, whether the council should be meeting with the Ombudsman instead of just me.
Thank you, Councillor. We'll take that as an item to discuss later on as an urgent item. Any other urgent items? Councillor Bailey.
I have two urgent items, Chair. One is this morning's headline in the Hawke's Bay today about the E. coli counts in the Napier water supply, and the other one is a report I've received this week regarding discharges into the Ahuriri estuary of raw sewage by the Napier City Council.
Thank you, Councillor Bailey. I just wonder whether staff could be conscious of that particular request and whether Mr Maxwell might be able to attend later in the day. Councillor Hewitt.
Minor item, annual plan hearing dates.
Annual plan hearing date. Councillor Belford.
Electric vehicles.
Minor item,
Minor
urgent
item.
item.
Minor item.
Minor item. Electric vehicles. Any other items? Councillor Wilson.
Trends.
Trends. Trends. Any other items? No? All right, we'll look to consider those items at the end of play. We now move to agenda item 7, which is the Ruataniwha water storage scheme on page 11. I'm sure councillors will have considered this particular item very closely, and I'm just wondering whether, just in regard to it, Mr Palmer, can you advise, you've tabled a letter from HBRC. I wonder whether you could just quickly reference that, and I think you've got another tabled item, second one, an RMA discussion. Yes, that's relevant to this discussion, I take it.
It is, thank you, Chair.
So you've received those two items that have been tabled?
So just to explain what councillors have before them, first of all, the document that was circulated yesterday, I believe, probably by email, and is sitting before you, dated 4 May from the Hawke's Bay Regional Investment Company. That was a letter provided to the council in response to the review of the Ruataniwha water storage scheme, and it was included in your meeting papers for the 10th of May meeting at which you received the review report. So you have received it previously. I just included it to support the discussion that we are about to embark on around the next steps on the scheme, because it is the company's view or recommended response to the review. And we have Mr O'Keefe, Mr Dash with us this morning to talk through these items in greater depth. I have also provided you with the legal advice that was shared from the Environmental Defence Society last night. So it literally came in about 5 o'clock last night, and it's their legal advice which they have said they're very comfortable with council viewing in relation to the likelihood of the Environment Court receiving or accepting an application for a declaration on the RWSS consents interpretation.
Mr. Chairman, do we have any advice from our legal counsel on that matter?
On that matter, the substantive paper that's before you had suggested as a possible recommendation was that we would seek legal advice, and I understand that HBRC itself has received its own legal advice, and so the question at this point really is whether, in light of HBRC having received advice, EDS having received advice, whether the council needs to also receive advice, or whether we simply move to applying to the court and seeing what sort of response they give us. So that option is available to you and is included in the matters for discussion today.
Well, I certainly want to hear from someone other than a pressure group.
Chair, can I suggest that we invite Mr O'Keefe and Mr Daish to come forward?
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about that. In terms of the structure of your paper, where is the best point for HBRC perspectives to be considered, and which part of the paper are they particularly related to?
So I think the financial section around uptake, it would be useful to hear from Mr O'Keefe in relation to those issues, and also in relation to the environmental management challenges for the scheme that were highlighted by the review. Mr Daish is here in particular to hear the discussion from councillors and to seek some guidance from the council in relation to those environmental management matters that you would like further explored by HBRC. And the point that I need to reinforce here is that HBRC is the consent holder, and so we have the council wearing two hats today. The council is the regulator of Plan Change 6 and of the consents for the RWSS. It is also a co-investor, so we are wearing both of those hats, and I'm just keen that we keep those two reasonably distinct, which is to say that matters that the consent holder needs to give consideration to and potentially do more work on is a matter for HBRC. And then there are some legal interpretation issues which the council needs to consider in relation to both Plan Change 6 and the consents.
Thank you, Mr Palmer. That's part of the reason for asking that question, and I'll just seek some clarification from Councillors Bevan and Hewitt as to which hat they reference and whether we've got clarity around that, or whether we need in fact to make recognise that particular issue, the consent holder versus the consent regulator.
Well, until the conversation around this table unfolds, it's very difficult for us to take any view at all as to whether we might be facing a conflict. So I think you have to leave it in our hands to exercise sensible judgment around those things, Chair.
Councillor Hewitt.
So I have taken a very deliberate decision with the Chair of HBRC to manage any potential conflict, and in terms of decisions coming to Council, I've been on blackout and I've got a paper trail to support that.
Sure.
So I'm very clear that my hat is in this ring and there
Sure.
is no conflict.
Yeah, that's fine. I just thought it was worth raising the issue in regard to the consenter regulator.
Yeah, there are two separate
Sure. Okay.
answers from us.
So you're comfortable to remain and contribute in the discussion and using your judgments around which part of the equation you're looking at. So that's fine. It's up to you to manage. Councillor Bevan.
Yeah, if I could just go back to address the legal issues that you've raised here around advice on the likelihood of the Environment Court accepting the application or not. So what you've tabled is some advice from EDS, which in a nutshell says there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to go ahead, right? So if we followed the line taken by Councillor Dick and went and got advice on this, and our advice was contrary to that, and it said it's not very likely that the Environment Court would accept this case, where does that leave us? Because if the environmental lobby groups are going ahead anyway, would we not still want to be part of that? So that leads me to the conclusion that going and getting some separate legal advice on this matter is not going to be helpful, and I would much rather, if we're going to get legal advice, I would much rather that legal advice was delivered to help us frame the application in a way that makes it most likely that it would be accepted by the court. That would be much more helpful in my view. I'm interested to hear your opinion on that.
Councillor, it may have been overly implicit and not sufficiently explicit in the paper that was provided to you that it is my view that given the inevitability of the environmental NGOs seeking a court declaration, that we're best just to join that and get on with the job and use that as an opportunity to clarify as many of the matters that we need clarification on as well. So I guess I'm very much in that camp. We initially, when this issue was raised, given that the Environment Court does have a policy around hypothetical, not hearing hypothetical cases, I did wonder whether we might put an enormous amount of energy into developing an application that had little chance of being heard. But I think based on the legal advice that I've seen here from EDS and the legal advice I understand that HBRC is in receipt of as well, that there's at least an even chance of the application being heard, and on that basis would probably be most prudent just to get on with the job.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer.
Mr. Chairman?
Before calling Councillor Wilson, I just want to seek your advice as to this approach. Rather than Mr. Palmer going through his paper in great detail, I wonder whether we simply make that you ask questions of Mr. Palmer about it. I'm assuming everyone's all over this paper. Once that process has taken place, we'll ask Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Dash to come to the table and then pose issues and questions. Are you comfortable doing it, proceeding on that basis?
Well, yes, Mr. Chairman, but just on the topic of application to the Environment Court, perhaps I need explaining to me as to why we should join with two environmental lobby groups in this matter, when there are other very significant stakeholders that we have an obligation to, manifested in organisations like Federated Farmers and Fruit Growers. Where do they fit into this?
We did anticipate that any application to the court would be done jointly with HBRC, and HBRC has a range of stakeholders that I think they would probably wish to engage with in relation to the consent conditions. I have a personal view that where we are trying to determine the interpretation of a consent condition for an individual consent holder, that would normally be an appropriate thing for the council to work through with the consent holder on essentially a bilateral basis. This one becomes a little bit more interesting given that there are other parties expressing an interest in this interpretation. If it's a planning matter on which we're seeking a declaration, I think a broader range of stakeholders should be included in the dialogue and the preparation of that. And I guess this will go to the scope of the application. If it is very narrow and it is in relation solely to the consent conditions, I think our primary focus would be on having a dialogue with the consent holder and framing the questions for the court in that way. We could, of course, seek a declaration simply by the council and or with HBRC to the court separately from that of EDS and Fish and Game. My expectation is the court would wish us to combine those applications in the interests of efficiency of their time, and that would make sense. So if the council is of a view that it wants a broader range of matters, including plan interpretation and its impact on non-RWSS farmers, and it would certainly be my view that there is value in getting a declaration on the broader matters as well, then I think the issue you've raised, Councillor, is an important one, and that is that we cast our net a bit broadly with a range of our known stakeholders in this space and seek their interest in being involved in crafting the declaration. application and being involved in the court hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. I just want to, Councillor Dick, you are comfortable with that?
Yep.
I wonder whether I can seek your indulgence to frame your questions in the order of the paper, so we've got a very focused discussion going on. That is, for example, financial, legal, etc. If you work your way through on that basis, would you be comfortable working? Councillor Wilson, you're next.
Well, I suppose I can sneak this into financial. Around the that previous discussion, who's paying for the joint piece of work? Are they saying we're paying? How does that work, or are we saying they're paying?
That's not a conversation we've had with the NGOs at this point in time. My expectation is that any costs incurred in terms of legal representation, what have you, would be borne by the applicants themselves, and that we would be covering the costs from our own regulatory part of the business, particularly so we get clarity around our obligations in administering the consent. So costs would lie where they fall largely. In terms of the Environment Court's own costs, there will be an application fee, and I suspect that will not be particularly onerous, and that is something that the council could pick up, or we could have a shared cost discussion with the other applicants.
Well, I'd encourage that. I mean, we've got some expertise that has got an inherent value. They may argue the same, but I just want everyone to be very clear who's getting the benefit out of the chequebook signatories.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Barker, have you got a question you'd like to pose at this stage?
No, just the issue Councillor Beck raised was going to contribute to that. I think it's been covered off.
Oh, look, thank you. Any other questions from councillors in regard to perhaps financial and legal issues? Councillor Graham, have you got a question then at all? Or no? Okay.
Chair,
Councillor Bailey.
I suppose if you're talking about paragraph number 7 in the paper, that comes under a legal issue, does it?
I guess it does.
It does. Chair, through you, I note that the resource consent, the RWSS resource consents were granted in June 2015, which is coming up 2 years ago. I'm curious as to why it has taken almost 2 years for us to be receiving advice about the limitations around Plan Change 6. It seems that we've been left holding the cart here, and and I'm just curious to know from staff, I suppose, as to was this review the first instance where they considered the challenges around the limitations of Plan Change 6, or had they been considered before, and if so, what discussions had taken place around that?
Chair, some of this predates my tenure, but the documents that I have reviewed in recent months have suggested that the issues around legal interpretation and the consequential complexities of implementing both Plan Change 6 and the exercising of the RWSS consents were well understood in the closing stages of the Board of Inquiry's process. So you'll recall that the Board of Inquiry provided an initial judgment set of decisions in 2014. They were subsequently appealed to the High Court. The Board of Inquiry was directed to make some further amendments to their decisions in 2015. During that period, both HBRC and HBRC appealed to the Board of Inquiry for greater clarification on a range of these matters, and was acutely aware at that point in time of the issues that would give rise to. So there is evidence to suggest that it was an ongoing matter of discussion and concern. What I don't know is how much of that was brought back to the council table during, I guess, the latter stages of 2015 and early last year. There was obviously much discussion around the future of the scheme and a number of different council processes in relation to the investment. There were briefings provided on Plan Change 6 that I was privy to earlier last year, and a significant range of complexities in relation to that implementation were raised at the council table. And I think rather famously, Mr. Cam Drury provided a presentation on that overwhelmed councillors somewhat in its level of detail, but I know that he laid out extensively a large range of issues with respect to Plan Change 6 and its interpretations and implementation, etc. So it's not all news that's come about as a result of the review. The concerns have been long-standing, and I think, unfortunately, it was not only HBRC and HBRC that sought greater clarity around these matters from the Board of Inquiry. It was actually stakeholders across the board, and for whatever reason, the Board of Inquiry decided not to provide further clarity, and has left it to all stakeholders to now work through, whether it be through further policy development or through Environment Court declarations such as this.
Councillor Bailey.
Yeah, just to follow up from that then, James. Thank you for that. I'm much better informed now of the process that happened at the time. I'm curious to know then if those discussions were being had early last year as to why this particular issue hadn't begun to be managed with some sense of urgency. Because that seems to be lacking as well.
Councillor, I am presuming that you're referring to managing the issues around Plan Change 6 implementation. Look, I think it's fair to say that there's been a chicken and egg situation with respect to the RWSS. As the review has highlighted, the RWSS and Plan Change 6 have some strong interdependencies. And the chicken and egg that was going on in the last, 18 months about whether the scheme was going to proceed or not had an impact on how much work is further done on Plan Change 6 and where does this leave us in terms of Plan Change 6. So, it has been a messy and somewhat circular process over the last 18 months, and I think all of that was borne out through the review.
Evan, then Councillor Belford.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a legal question, but it's going to take me a minute to get to it because I need to go through a bit of an explanation, and this in many ways goes to the core of some of the difficult questions that we have to answer here. So in the review paper that you did, James, there was a lot of information about the fact that we've got this problem because the luck limits look like they've got 30% headroom on farm, whereas DIN is already being exceeded in many catchments. That was based on something like 100 odd FEMPs that have been filed to date. Now, there's a question mark in my mind about whether those FEMPs were representative of farms across the area that we're talking about, and of course we all know that not one single FEMP was a FEMP from a proposed RWSS farm. So when I just want to read from the document from one of the review areas that we did, and it says here, in reviewing overseer runs from sheep and beef properties from Land Vision and Rural Direction show that for intensive beef operations and lamb finishing, these operations were generally slightly above or just at their permissible end loss limits. Now, given that something like 76 or whatever % of the entire catchment is beef, mixed beef, dairy, whatever, I'm wondering whether the 111 FEMPs and the averaging that we've done to come up with this 30% headroom still on farm is actually an accurate assessment of what we're going to face once all of these FEMPs are done. And I don't know what the answer to that question is. I don't know if anybody does. It then goes on to say that for less intensive farms, there is some headroom. So there's going to be a mix. So there's question marks in my mind about whether the luck limits are actually being exceeded or whether they're not being exceeded. But there is a table here which breaks the farm systems down into mixed livestock, irrigated dairy, arable livestock, arable live, and it goes through and gives some mitigating options that are available, and it gives the percentage reduction that can be achieved through relatively cost-effective mitigation measures that could be taken on farm. Like in one case, it could be reduced from 72 to 22 kilograms per hectare. Another one, 56 to 34. 69% savings, 39% savings, and so forth. Now, the legal question I have is, if we find, in fact, that the luck limits are not being exceeded or are barely being exceeded, and there's a 30% margin for error, I think, in them, but there are all these efficiencies can be made on farm, are we able legally to still set and require FEMPs that give those reductions, even though they're taking the farm nitrogen loss levels down below the allowable limits?
Look, first of all, can I just acknowledge the fact that in the review it was explicitly noted that caution needs to be used when drawing any conclusions about the existing FEMPs that we hold and drawing conclusions about those more broadly. So the limitations of that were known. This question was put to Mr. Norton during the second workshop that we had, and I think Councillor Belford particularly focused on this point, and it was Mr. Norton's advice that there were 3 different approaches taken, including using further trim modelling by Dr. Kit Rutherford. And so there was some corroboration of that headroom that was undertaken. So prima facie there is certainly an issue there, and we have acknowledged that we won't know definitively until all the FEMPs are in what the overall land use and overall overseer losses are estimated to be catchment wide. So we are having to use a bit of guesstimation at this point in time. In answer to your very specific question, we have no ability to require anything other than a farm environment plan be prepared and implemented for the permitted activity status. So a range of the mitigations that are listed in the document may or may not be part of the farm environment management plan. Where they form industry good management practice, we would expect those to be in an acceptable FEMP that would be signed off. The issue that we have is that if the LUC rate is being met, and yet in that subcatchment we have a DIN exceedance, we then become limited in terms of what we can do. In the year 2020, all of the properties in those DIN exceeding catchments, and there are 6 of them presently, subcatchments, they all go into resource consent. Now, our ability to impose conditions to require the sorts of actions that you have highlighted in there is an open question at this point in time. When we try to look for guidance on this, we can see that within the plan there is particular wording about reasonable and practical measures that sit in the restricted discretionary category. So where we've got a farm that is exceeding its LUC rate by more than 30%, they're non-complying, and it's quite clear that they will have to take whatever measures to get them down to a 30% exceedance. Once they get into the 0 to 30% exceedance over their LUC rate, then there is quite a lot of prescription in the plan about what we can require. And as I say, it's quite clear in that it's reasonable and practicable. So where that leaves us is that if reasonable and practical measures still don't get us down to a 0.8 DIN, and you can think about the subcatchment that's currently at 420%, it's at that point that we don't know where to go to next, because at that point industry best practice may not get you the number that the plan is seeking, and it may be that it's a land use change that is necessary, and there is no lever within the plan at the moment to force that to happen. And I guess that is the area of great uncertainty at this point in time.
Just to follow up to that, so is that one of the points that we can get clarification on from an application to the Environment Court as to what we can include in those resource consents? Because that's what the farmers are going to be facing. They they might be okay on their farms in terms of the luck limits being met, but we still have a problem with DIN being exceeded. So at that point, they have to get resource consents anyway. Is that correct?
That's well, by in 2020 they will be required to.
So they're going to have to get resource consent. So one of the questions we need to find out from the Environment Court is whether we can require best practice or other management that will force the limit down from their current allowable luck limits.
Look, that's quite correct, Councillor, and that issue is well up our list of things we'd want to seek clarity on. And I'd just like to point out that it's not also a static story, it's a dynamic story. And one of the things that we'd want clarity from the Environment Court would be whether or not the expectation would be that we would first require best management practice, and we would first require everybody to meet their LUC rates, and then to monitor, because the trigger points in the plan relate to 5-year rolling averages. We've got to build a 5-year database around DIN, a data set around DIN anyway. And at what point do you ramp up essentially your requirements on farmers, particularly if it's not going to be practical to get to 0.8 by 2030 under any scenario. And prima facie, it looks like we've got some subcatchments where best management practice, people sticking to their LUC rates won't get you there by 2030. So what is a reasonable time frame for something like some greater land use controls or controls on stocking rates or whatever it might be? So all those matters do need to be worked through, and there are a whole range of additional complexities about who's responsible for what reductions, about the nitrogen load to come, the timing around that, about the three-dimensional movement of nitrogen in and out of subcatchments, and all of those matters are highly complex scientific assessments that will need to sit in behind any regulatory framework. And right now, there are more questions than answers on all of that.
Thanks, Mr. Palmer. Councillor Belford.
So I actually had a financial question, but I have a follow-up to this to bring this to a sharper point, I guess. So what I hear you saying is that as two examples here, to bring a subcatchment within a DIN limit with luck limits being met, so to speak, we don't know whether we have the authority to either A, impose, for example, a stocking limit, if given what Peter was raising earlier about beef and sheep, et cetera, being a predominant usage here. We don't know whether we have the authority to put in one of these consents. Here is a maximum stocking limit that we know will have an effect if we bring that down, or a straightforward land use. We're going to proscribe a certain land use. Let's say it's dairying on light soil, period. Are you saying we don't know whether we have the authority to do either of those two things?
In theory, under a resource consent, we can impose whatever conditions are necessary to avoid, remedy, or mitigate the environmental effect. However, there will be tests around the reasonableness of that, the practicality of it, whether scientifically it can be shown that the consent condition is going to directly deliver the effect mitigation that is being sought. All of that is likely to be contested in the fullness of time. What the Environment Court would likely say around any issue on that is that actually it's for the Council's policy through its plan to lay out how these things are going to work. And I guess what we're saying is that the plan at the moment doesn't. And if I look back through the deliberations of the Board of Inquiry, what was quite clear in their minds is that the Council would go back over time and review the plan and review the LUC rates and would alter those over time. So rather than dictating stocking rates or dictating specific land use, simply the LUC rates would be used as an equitable mechanism across the board to lower over time what is permissible on any given land. And then it's over to the farmer to work out whether they reduce stocking rates or they put cows on concrete or whatever else they do to manage within those limits. And at the moment, we just don't have those mechanisms in the plan.
It's sufficient, Councillor Bell? Can I go to my financial? Go to your financial question, please.
The discussion in financial leads to a recommendation to 2.4 regarding raising the minimum purchase requirement. And so this is the paper we're reading is the staff basically concurring with Mr. Palliret and sort of rounding the number up a bit and falling arbitrarily on 50, correct? Whereas we have a chart in Mr. Palliret's paper to us that indicates clearly that all costs recovered and free cash can be used to pay dividends to shareholders requires 65 to 70 million. Why would that not be a more prudent recommendation from the staff to us to raise the limit to 65?
So, Councillor, in the review, we noted that there is no magic number, if you like. There's no right or wrong. There's a gradation of risk, and obviously there are greater returns that are delivered to different capital providers on different uptake scenarios, and that is not something that has a particular line in the sand around. The recommendation for 50 is not a number the staff have come up with. The recommendation of 50 comes from the fact that the HBRC board has recommended 50 in their response to the review, and that is recommended is highlighted in the paper, and it's simply recommended off the basis of that recommendation from HBRC.
So wouldn't it be simple common sense, though, that any investor or any lender to this project would have to feel more comfortable with a higher required investment rate? So why would any one of those parties oppose lifting this rate? Because
I think, and look, the scheme at this present point in time is council policy, in so much as there are previous resolutions of this council to invest subject to certain conditions being met. It sits in the long-term plan. So the council, like other investors, is weighing up whether or not putting the CP on uptake at such a high level that it precludes the scheme getting across the ground, pushes it to a point where actually the council's position is disadvantaged. So yes, the higher the level of uptake at the outset, the better in terms of de-risking returns, but there is a flip side to it in that potentially the council sets a bar that is too high. I mean, look, at an ideal world, initial uptake would be 100%, and all of the financials for the scheme would be guaranteed from day one. Well, in any greenfields enterprise, that's an unrealistic proposition from day one, and we've explored that extensively through the review as to why there isn't a higher level and why the level is where it is, and I guess therefore there's a balance of risks for the council to consider.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor
Well, I was just going to ask the question, the obvious question. Obviously, the level of comfort does exist at 50 million cubes, because that's a recommendation from HBRC, who've been dealing with the investors.
Well, the board of HBRC have expressed their comfort at that level. That's correct.
You may wish to. Exactly. You may wish to ask that question when they take the chair. Councillor Bailey.
Just a follow-up from that question, James. So the recommendation of 50 cubes is based on the what the risk level that HBRC is prepared to take, but not necessarily what the council is prepared to take.
That's correct. We haven't undertaken any independent analysis beyond what was provided to you by way of the review, so we haven't done any further work to scrutinise those numbers. Obviously, Mr. Palliret gave a range of different numbers that deliver different outcomes. HBRC are the ones who are providing, I guess, the exercising commercial judgment on behalf of the council. The board is appointed by the council to perform precisely that function, and that is what they've recommended back as the 50 million cubes. So staff have not sought to second guess, I guess, that role of the board of HBRC.
With any other financial questions or those on the legal issues that people might have, Councillor Belford, were you interested to pursue the application to the Environment Court issue at all? Is there anything there that you see as adding value to the commentary?
Well, I guess if there doesn't seem to be much more general discussion, I was going to request that we actually work through the recommendations one at a time, and any further debate, clarification might occur item by item, would be more focused, and we'd make some progress in clearing this off the table.
Yes, I think that's a
so that I will address that at 2.8 when we get to 2.8.
Thank you. Councillor Hewitt.
Just to flag that after I've heard from all the speakers, I may come back to other questions. Just, you're not ruling that out.
We're wanting a wide-ranging consideration, but an orderly one. So this is the orderly bit.
Chair, if I may, can I suggest that it would be helpful to hear from Mr O'Keefe and Mr Daish before moving to the recommendations? That's the
intent. Thank you, Mr Palmer, but that was the intent. What we're looking to do now is simply to have councillors ask you questions of your paper, and then HBRC to come forward.
So maybe a final question for James then. Is there anything else that you would like to be flagging to us from your paper?
There is, thank you, Councillor. So in relation to the letter from HBRC, which was retabled, on page 3, they have outlined a range of recommendations, and I guess I just want to draw to the Council's attention that some of these I think are already implicit in the recommendations you've got, and some sit outside. So they have recommended a new conditions precedent around the land exchange matter being resolved before proceeding, and I think, look, it's open to the council as to whether or not it wishes to add an additional CP. You already have before you a recommendation that the moratorium be extended until the matter is resolved. So those issues are related. I guess the scheme is not going to proceed if a land swap cannot occur. There has been previous discussion around the Public Works Act, but I believe that HBRC's position that has been expressed previously is that's not a route that they would be following at this point in time. Over to you whether or not you feel that you need to be explicit about that condition precedent. They've also recommended in their recommendation 3.3.4 that there be a review of environmental incentives and penalties. I would propose that be bundled up in the overall review of the environmental management package. It's just a component of that. 3.3.5, they've recommended resetting the CP around a bankable construction contract. So again, Mr O'Keefe will speak to that, but that could be an additional recommendation added today. They have recommended the council conducts the modelling on the benefit of flushing flows, and as you'll see from your paper, it's recommended the flushing flows be dealt with in the recommendation from for HBRC to do more work on that. That's not a big deal. We actually have the Goldson model that can estimate the efficacy of that flushing flow in-house at HBRC, and it is not a major job for us to do that piece of work. And then the final thing I just draw to your attention is 3.3.9. They have, HBRC has suggested that the requirement of a 6% return on the investment be reconsidered. And they have suggested here that it is reconsidered as part of the LTP process. My recommendation to you is that it's not a matter that needs to be resolved today, but is clearly a matter that does need to be resolved in the fullness of time as we develop the LTP. So I haven't proposed a recommendation on that, but you may wish to have discussion on that today.
Thanks, Mr Palmer. Councillor Belford, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah. So if I could put this as a question, would it be correct to say that the combined effect of 3.3.2, 3.3.5, 3.3.6, 3.3.7, and 3.3.9 is to say that no condition precedent is presently met?
That would be a question I'd want to put to Mr. O'Keefe to answer definitively, but certainly on the face of it, that appears to be the case.
Councillor, until they come to the table. Thank you. Councillor Barker.
On 3.3.8, the numbering system is designed to trick, I think. I see that we've got here modelling the specs. I've been from Flushing and advised to investing an additional 2.9 million. I'd like you to explain to me the way, is it investing? One proves that you're investing, you're going to get a return. So is this the correct use of the term, or investing? And the 2.9 million, and how this would, the link between this and improvements. I want to see the logic chain outlined. I can't see it from this.
Again, is that a question for...
I want my independent advisor to tell me first, please.
So the reason I believe that HBRC have described it as an investment is that it would provide flushing capacity that exceeds that which is necessary to offset the effects of the scheme. Indeed, a large portion of the flushing will provide benefits over and above mitigating the impacts of the extent of dewatering, if you like, that occurs as a consequence of water storage of higher flows. So there's an environmental dividend or an environmental benefit that would come from that additional expenditure, which is why it's described as an investment. And I guess it's also described as an investment because it's part of the capital cost of the asset, and therefore an additional $2.95 million will be added to the overall capital value of the scheme, of which the council will be an indirect shareholder through HBRC and the RWLP.
Just tell me, do you believe the economics of that? I mean, I know I'm getting the spin of it, but investing, what I want to know is where is the logic chain that comes from that you get a return on it? There's nothing here that compels me to believe that there is a return on this. It's an assertion, and what I want to hear was a logic chain that leads me to an inevitable conclusion. I don't get that.
So it adds to the capital value of the scheme. So to that extent, and to the extent that capital value would be realised at the point of sale, or an appreciation in the value of that asset over time, that there might be a return on it. But it doesn't generate additional revenue for the scheme. It does deliver an environmental benefit.
Mr. Chairman,
It does?
So the view from Dr. Measures, who reviewed this area as part of the review, was that from lifting the flow out of the bottom of the dam from 30 cumex to 50 cumex would deliver, which is what is intended here, would deliver additional benefits in terms of the efficacy of the flushing, so better environmental outcomes. That was his advice, and when asked point blank whether he thought it was worth spending $2.95 million, he said yes.
And is it also not true, Chair, is it also not true that Dr. whatever his name is talked about the flushing flows, also said that it's doubtful that there is any benefit in the lower Toki of flushing flows?
He certainly said there was uncertainty about the benefits in the lower reaches, and he couldn't quantify whether or not they are substantive in the lower reaches.
Thanks, Mr. Palmer. I'll
Mr. Chairman,
go to Councillor Dick very shortly, but we just want to follow a good process here.
Well,
Councillor.
it's a continuation of the issue that Councillor Barker has raised. There's a bit of confusion there. Maybe it's only in my mind, but I understand the 2.9 million to be the cost of increasing the bore size of the outlet and the associated valves, so that a much greater volume of water could be released. So it's an investment in the capital cost of the project.
Well, it's a value judgment, and can we keep continuing to go through? And again, Councillor Barker quite correctly pointed out that we have the advice coming from our independent advisor to council, and soon we will get the advice coming from HBRC. So that's the sequence here, and I'm interested to know whether we've sufficiently, and we've drifted into the environmental issues here, are there any other environmental issues that councillors want to raise from their independent advisor on the...
Yeah, so there's just a fundamental Environment 101 question. Is nitrogen in the concentration of 0.8, is that a nutrient or is it a toxin?
The advice that we've received to date is that at that level it is a nutrient level that will be taken up by plants in the river, algae. It doesn't represent a toxicity level for aquatic life at 0.8.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Mr. Chair today. Thank you, Councillor. Now, if there are no further questions on the environmental management, there are, Councillor Bevan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at your recommendation 2.5.1, James, and this relates to the proposal for an environmental CP. You don't mention phosphorus, only nitrogen. Is there a reason for that?
Only in so much as phosphorus management plans are required under the scheme, and the scheme is required to be phosphorus neutral or better. So the RWSS, by its very resource consents, cannot exacerbate the phosphorus management challenge in the catchment, and indeed is required to undertake a range of measures to better manage phosphorus. So it just hasn't been mentioned here on the basis that it was not an area that was flagged in the review or in subsequent discussion with councillors as requiring additional work. But there's no difficulty with looking at it as part of the totality of the environmental management package.
Okay, so just a follow-up question to that, if you wouldn't mind, Chair. I'm agreed in principle that we need to have an environmental condition precedent in here. The problem is we really don't have very much information yet, as we've discussed earlier today, about what measures we can take. We're going to be heading off to court, we hope, to get some clarity about the timeframes we're in and so forth. And if we're going to proceed with this, I'm really keen that this is transparent for farmers, that farmers know what our expectations of them are, both non-RWSS farmers and RWSS farmers. And I'm really concerned that this is going too soon with a CP on the environment that is close to being meaningless. And I'm wondering how you would respond to the notion that we put this on hold until we have more information about what tools we have in our toolkit, what the targets actually are going to end up being, because they might be adjusted by the Environment Court, and that we come back to this and frame up a more meaningful CP further down the track once we have more information.
No difficulty with doing that in a sense. We were simply trying to kick off the work, and this was a way of doing it that's relatively open-ended and broad casting. Mr. Daish, as I understand it, is going to provide some detail around those environmental management options today, so he was hoping to enrich this discussion. Look, we're just in the timeframes we've had to churn these papers out subsequent to the review. We haven't had the opportunity to sit down and write a full-blown paper on all of these environmental management issues subsequent to what was raised in the review. So look, he may wish to fill some of the gaps on that today, but the idea had been to not try to get prescriptive at this point, given that there is a range of matters that need further work on them and clarification. The point of having this CP being met at least 2 months prior to financial close was something which I developed in discussion with Mr. O'Keefe at HBRC on the basis that he also felt that it was important that all investing parties understood the nature of those environmental management expectations and requirements on the scheme prior to bringing home financial close. So, and that would include the farming community as well.
Can I come in with a question of my own here, Mr. Palmer? Can you say whether, in fact, introducing this inquiry around the environmental issues would, as a condition precedent, would add value and be more transparent with those potential investors and including the landowners? So, if we go with the CP now, or do we wait for more greater clarity? Which of those is more, would you suggest, adds clarity to the situation?
Look, I think the sooner the council signals its intentions, the better in general terms. Deferring ACP, look, I think based on what Councillor Bevan just commented on, there's likely to be relatively broad support for the idea of an environment CP. So if there is, I think signalling that now is useful. And I think not signalling that at this point, if that is the intent of council, simply waiting until the detail comes forward doesn't achieve any additional benefit.
Councillor Belford.
I'm supposing you don't want to get into a debate yet as to the viability of that particular, so I'll stay calm at the moment. But just to press Peter's first part of his question as to why no phosphorus in here, the whole thrust of this big fat book here is to say that the biggest challenge to the catchment is managing phosphorus. And so why one would not make explicit in a condition precedent whenever it is to come that is part of what we wish to review, are the viability actually of achieving that particular set of limits is just as much an issue as the viability of achieving DIN limits or other nitrogen reductions. So one would think this should be totally inclusive by the time it gets drafted.
Thank you, Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Just some advice from our independent advisor, working along those lines. One of the things that concerns me about this environmental management issue, and especially the management of the RWSS customers or land water users, is that we have delegated responsibility for management and enforcement of individual consents off to what is essentially a limited liability partnership. So in other words, we as council, as the regional council, have lost control of the management of those particular resource consents directly. We can manage them indirectly through managing the partnership, but not the individual land users. And given that one of the benefits that, as Tom keeps on touting about the pistol that comes out there, is the partnership's ability to pull the lever and stop the water flowing and still expect and still have the water user paying for the water. And given the way in which we have been found under the Havelock Water Inquiry about our ability to manage and enforce resource consents, what confidence can we have that the limited liability partnership, who we only have representation on, because there are other investors who have seats around the board and probably, if I recall correctly, end up with a majority around the board. What confidence can we have is that enforcement action will actually be taken? Because I have serious doubts that if we're in a situation where all the water has not been sold, and we are not meeting our
Point of order, Chair. He's asked the question. Let's have the answer. We don't need Councillor Bailey to answer the question he just asked.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Can you come to your point of your question very quickly, Councillor?
Yep. What, in your opinion, can we have any confidence?
Already asked it.
The councillor.
In your opinion, what confidence can we have any confidence that the partnership will enforce the consent requirements on water users?
As I think was indicated reasonably clearly in the review, the extent to which compliance with the consent conditions is achieved is very much in the hands of the council. So the council is the consenting authority, and regardless of our shareholding in the RWLP, whether it be 50%, 20%, 10% or no percent, we still remain the regulator. So the Regional Council does hold the levers in terms of assessing compliance and holding the scheme to account for those. I would say that the scheme has an awful lot at stake financially, and including its social licence to operate, to be incentivising achievement with those consent conditions. And I would contrast that against the status quo, which is we presently have virtually no regulation over land use and land practice apart from the emergent requirement for farm environment plans in the catchment. And it may well be that the scheme has a stronger set of incentives and a stronger set of levers overall to manage land use to meet those consent requirements, and it may be a damn sight easier for us to regulate one party that is doing that in a particularly well-resourced manner than trying to do that over some hundreds of properties on a bilateral property-by-property basis. And we've seen the benefits of global consents with the Twyford Irrigators Collective in that when a group comes together, resources its ability to operate collectively, that it can be a particularly effective way of doing resource management, and it is an emerging best practice notion around the country.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Can
Very
we
quick
just,
follow-up,
excuse me,
please,
Councillor, if we could just keep both our questions and our answers much more concise than they are presently. Councillor Bailey, you've got a very brief
Yes, I
follow-up.
have. Just to follow up from that, James. So, if I read you, if I heard you correctly, then what you're suggesting is that as the council, we do have the ability to turn off the tap on a water user.
No, we have the ability to require the consent conditions to be complied with and take enforcement action if they are not. They relate very much to the environmental outcomes. It's absolutely over to the scheme to determine whether or not water is turned on or off.
Thanks, Mr. We'll wait for you to come to the table. I do want to follow up and again focus the discussion here. Would it be reasonable to assume that the issue as to application of the consent and compliance around the consent would be an issue that would be addressed in a condition precedent inquiry around the environmental management of the scheme?
Yes, and I think it also relates to the court declaration question. So there are a matter of ambiguities, as has been well canvassed with respect to the consent, and so I think that's one of the reasons why that I've suggested in this paper that we need to bring back a package, if you like, of understanding of how the consents are interpreted, what the scheme is proposing to do, and how the outcomes are going to be delivered.
Yeah, thanks, James. So the answer to that is yes. We've sorry to do that to you, James. Are there any other issues, if there are not any other issues on environmental management of James, sorry, that's on environment, is it, Councillor? Yeah, okay, where you go.
Subsequent to Councillor Bailey's. James, can you just confirm the dates that all properties in the catchment over and above 4 hectares have to have a farm environmental management plan in place, with or without Ruataniwha?
So June 2018, so next year.
And the start date of Ruataniwha is potentially beyond that, well and truly now. So
that's correct.
So everyone has to be under the farm environmental management plan in the catchment, no matter what. Yeah, so
that's correct, Councillor.
I think that's a really important fact for the considerations.
Councillor, we're now up. I think we're up to the issue that I want to raise. Question I've got here is around the moratorium. Question for James, and it goes to your recommendations. And I'm seeing a bit of a conflict where we're looking to extend the moratorium, but we're also asking HBRC to undertake a very substantive piece of work. What are the implications of a blanket moratorium versus a limited moratorium? Can you help me there, please?
One of the things that we have become aware of through the course of the review and subsequent discussions on next steps is that HBRC had a large body of work in train last year around nitrogen management in particular, but also giving effect to its resource consents. Unfortunately, well, that work stopped at the point that the moratorium was imposed last year. And so some of the questions that councillors now have could potentially have been answered more readily had that work continued. So there is a need now to reignite that work, if you like, and if the moratorium precludes that work being undertaken, then there will be no further information that we will be able to provide other than council work around consent interpretation issues.
Thanks, James. Any other issues on the moratorium consideration in the paper, which has got significant recommendations? Councillor Wilson.
I was actually waiting to ask HBRC when they came up.
Okay, that's fine. Hold those questions for HBRC. Any issues in terms of the financial resource implications as outlined on page 13. Anything there that you want to ask James at the minute? And then I'm planning to bring Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Daish to the table, 10 minutes of discussion with them, and morning tea, and then deliberation on the recommendations. Is anyone quite comfortable with that approach? Thank you. Any issues on the moratorium? Oh, sorry, the funding implications, resources. We're all comfortable with that, spending all this vast sums of money on this stuff? Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. So I'm on number 17, and it has here that this money that's been spent is capitalised into the scheme, but that's not my understanding. So can you explain to me where that money is coming from?
Yeah, I mean, the treatment of this is the same as the peer review for the Deloitte peer review. So, I mean, it's the same accounting treatment. Where's the money coming from? Council's investment fund. Yeah, Council's investments fund. Yeah.
So it's in terms of capitalising to the scheme, then it's not been. I mean, it's just going to be invoiced where?
Well, it'll. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this. And the figures are getting higher than we believe they should, but Council's investment in the scheme will be slightly over 80 million, obviously. At least the amount on our balance sheet will be slightly over 80 million, and so there'll be the 80 million going to HBRC if it's approved, plus some costs that Council have had to do for peer review and other reviews, which should be in the order of between 600,000 or 700,000.
Expecting HBRC to absorb that?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. I just wonder whether Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Daish could come to the table, and clearly there are a range of issues. Please take your place. There are a range of issues there that obviously HBRC will have a view on. In addition, you've tabled or had tabled the letters that we've referred to earlier. So, councillors, can you traverse all of those issues, probably 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll break at that point. Thank you. Have you got a presentation? Have you? Yeah, a very brief presentation, I take.
I'd actually really like to spend some time on that, Chair. I wonder whether we break now.
What do you want to do, councillors? Well, I wonder whether we've got 5 minutes. If before your presentation you could ask any questions around the letters that have been tabled, any issues in those, because there were some issues around those 3.3 page 3 of your letter that perhaps councillors may pursue you on, and then we'll go into that detail on your presentation, and then we'll break for morning tea.
Well, I'm sure that the guys have got something they'd like to say in advance, but my question is to Blair. Can you just outline the HBRC step-in rights in terms of the consent, so that it might tidy up some of the questions that have been coming around the table?
So just to, I think it was Mr. Bailey's question around what can the council do in the circumstances where the farms within the scheme catchment are not complying, and therefore the scheme is not compliant. The council actually has step-in rights to come in and take over the management of the scheme in order to ensure that that is remedied. So it goes beyond a normal regulatory requirement and beyond what the council could actually do with an individual farm. There's no legal grounds for the council to step in and run a farm, but under this arrangement the council can step in and take control of the scheme until such time as any environmental breaches are deemed to be satisfied.
And you would expect, or can we expect that you would make all of those issues around consenting and compliance around the scheme very, very apparent in any subsequent report that we request of HBRC and our own staff in regard to fulfilling any requirements of this environmental management inquiry?
Certainly. I mean, any information that we can provide that educates and confirms what's already in place can certainly be provided, and the intent of the discussion today is also to open the dialogue for what else, essentially. So more than happy to work with council in determining what it needs to be satisfied to proceed.
Just Councillor Belford.
Could you at some point tell us where that step-in authority resides?
That's within the concession deed between the council.
Yet to be agreed to and negotiated.
That's correct, yes, but it's currently drafted and understood and accepted by all of the investors into the scheme.
Councillor Bailey.
It just, through you, Chair, it just concerns me that from what you said, and thank you for being open about what's going on there. I really do appreciate that, but it kind of concerns me that you're implying to me that we have to ask the questions and you're quite happy to answer them. That's fine and that's really good. But I would like to see you providing us with, you're hearing our concerns,
yeah.
And I would like you to provide me with sufficient information to allay those concerns. Rather than me having to ask you the questions.
Sure, no, I'm just following the process that's been laid out. Our intention was to give a brief presentation to give some context and then take questions. So no intent to avoid the questions or to wait for them to come to us.
Thank you. Well, I think you're ready to do your presentation after we've had fed and watered here. Okay, so we'll do that. You're quite happy with that? Cup of tea?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
sorry, Councillor Dick.
We've got a lot to get through today. Can we keep the tea and lunch intervals as brief as possible? Because you're going to lose 2 councillors by 4 o'clock.
It's in your hands, councillors. We've got some scope to shuffle some agenda items down the batting order to accommodate that. Those councillors need to get away early.